I have spent my career dismantling supply routes. Find the choke point, apply pressure, watch the system collapse. When we severed the Kessler corridor, every simulation showed the outer colonies running out of food in 40 days. On day 41, a freighter docked. On day 42, 3 more. By day 46, I stood in front of my entire intelligence division and asked a question that made my scales itch. Where are they coming from? I would find out in 9 days. I would wish I hadn't. This is the story of a blockade that should have been perfect. The Corvic Dominion cut the Kessler corridor, the single supply artery feeding 12 human colonies. Every war model, every logistics simulation, every scrap of strategic doctrine said the same thing. The outer worlds would starve in 40 days. I built those models. I knew them. So when the freighters kept arriving anyway, I knew something was terribly wrong. What I didn't know was that Earth's supply line was never a line at all. And the answer, the real answer, would break everything I understood about warfare. My name is Threthval, and was, the finest logistics analyst in the Corvic Dominion. I have spent 60 cycles dismantling enemy supply networks. I know the exact tonnage of grain that collapses a civilization, the precise choke point that turns a fighting navy into a collection of floating tombs. When the High Command ordered me to plan the severing of the Kessler corridor, I did it in an afternoon. The corridor is a narrow lane of calm space, threading between 3 pulsar fields and a volatile nebula. It is the only navigable route through the shroud expanse. For 600 years, every human freighter traveling from the inner worlds to the 12 outer colonies used that corridor. You cannot simply fly around it. The pulsars would fry your navigation. The nebula would scatter your sensors and melt your hull. There is no alternative. This is what I told the War Council. This is what every analysis confirmed. Cut the corridor and you isolate the colonies completely. 40 days, maybe 45 at most, before food reserves run out. The colonies sustain 3 billion humans. They import almost everything. The math was simple. The Dominion would not have to fire a single shot at the colonies themselves. We would simply wait, and they would beg us for terms. The day of the severance, I watched from my command deck as 3 dreadnoughts and 17 support cruisers deployed a minefield dense enough to stop light. The corridor entrance became a wall of plasma and debris. No ship could pass. I issued the formal declaration. The colonies were blockaded, their supply line dead. And then I waited for the collapse. It is a patient game, this kind of warfare. You watch the monitors. You calculate consumption rates. You imagine the fear spreading through civilian populations. The first 10 days, nothing happened. That was expected. No ships attempted the corridor because it was suicide. The next 10 days, still silence, but I assumed the humans were conserving supplies, rationing, adjusting. I even felt a small measure of respect. They were not panicking. Day 25 came and went. By day 30, my junior analysts began to fidget. The colony of Artemis 6, which I had flagged as the most fragile, should have run through half its emergency reserves by then. Yet the communications intercepts we monitored showed no distress. We heard market prices for imported goods and they were stable. That was impossible. Day 40 arrived, and I stood in the main intelligence chamber, staring at the projection of the Kessler corridor as if it might reveal some hidden crack. The other officers avoided my eyes. On day 41, a freighter docked at Artemis 6. Its signature was unmistakable, a heavy-lift cargo vessel of human design, emerging from a vector we had not monitored. I replayed the sensor logs. The ship had appeared near the system's outer debris belt, as if it had simply materialized. It unloaded grain and medical supplies, then departed before we could intercept it. On day 42, 3 more freighters arrived. On day 43, 5. By day 45, a steady stream of human cargo ships was reaching every colony, and I had not slept in 32 hours. I ordered a full sweep of the corridor and every adjacent star system. Nothing. The blockade was intact. No human ship had entered the corridor. My staff began to whisper words like smuggler jump point or preposition stockpiles. I dismissed both. There are no jump points in the Shroud Expanse, and stockpiles do not explain fresh produce and brand new medical supplies stamped with manufacturing dates from last month. The council convened on day 46. I stood in the center of the room, my scales dry and dull from exhaustion, and I asked my assembled intelligence team a single question. I asked it because it was the only question that mattered, and I repeated it 11 times, one for each of the officers present because no one could produce an answer. Where are they coming from? The silence was a physical pressure. That evening, I authorized a new protocol. We would capture the next freighter alive. We would take its crew, its cargo, its navigation logs, and we would find the ghost route the humans had somehow conjured. On day 47, a Korthik hunter-killer squadron intercepted an independent human freighter named the Asterisk Stardust near the outer rim of the new Osaka colony. The captain, a gray-haired human female, surrendered without a fight. I interrogated her personally. She was not military, she was a civilian. She smelled of engine grease and stale coffee. She smiled at me. She actually smiled. I asked for her route. She handed over a navigation chip. The data was chaotic, a spiderweb of improvised jumps, random trajectories, and patches of space I would never have considered navigable. She had crossed 2 pulsar shadow zones, threaded a magnetic filament at an angle no standard chart permitted, and cruised through a corridor of space debris that technically did not exist on our maps. When I asked how she knew it was safe, she looked at me as if I were slow. "I didn't," she said, "but the colony needed the supplies, so I went anyway." I ran her route through our modeling systems. The statistical probability of that specific path succeeding was less than 6%, and yet she had made it, and so had 42 other captains, none of whom had used the same route. The maps of their journeys, when overlaid, looked like nothing I had ever seen. They were not a supply line. They were 43 separate solutions to an unsolved problem. I began to feel the edges of my understanding fray. Because if there was no single route, there was no way to blockade them all. The corridors of space are infinite. You cannot seal every crevice. And these humans, these civilians, were not waiting for orders. They were simply going. On day 49, I ordered a full intelligence sweep of Earth's merchant marine. The numbers hit me like a railgun. Over 400,000 independent captains operated across human space. Not a fleet, not a coordinated navy. A decentralized mass of individuals who owned their ships, plotted their own courses, and made their own decisions. 9% were already running supplies through unmapped routes, and the number was growing every day. They had no central command to disrupt, no master plan to steal, no single choke point to sever. I stared at the projection, my mind spinning through every countermeasure I knew, every doctrine of interdiction warfare I had perfected over 60 cycles. And then I finally understood what I was looking at. You cannot blockade a decision. And 40,000 humans, each one waking up that morning and choosing, against all logic, to fly into hell because some strangers on a distant colony needed them. That was not a supply line. That was a force of nature. I stood in the glowing light of my command center, alone, and realized with a slow, cold horror that I had just gone to war against an enemy I could not possibly beat, because it did not have a single throat I could choke. That night, I did something I had not done in 20 cycles. I sent a personal message to my father. My father is not a sentimental man. He is a retired logistics general who once starved an entire rebel system with nothing more than a spreadsheet and patience. If anyone in the Dominion understood what I was facing, it would be him. His response arrived within the hour. It was 3 words long. Run the numbers. I had run the numbers. That was the problem. The numbers said the colony should be dead. Yet every day, fresh sensor data showed cargo ships landing on worlds that should have been eating their own dead by now. I ordered my analysts to build a new model, one that assumed no central supply route at all. We fed in the captured navigation chips, the fragmentary sensor readings, and the interrogation transcripts from the Stardust captain. The simulation ran for 6 hours. When it finished, I stared at the output until my eyes burned. The probability of an individual freighter successfully reaching a colony through unmapped space was somewhere between 6 and 12%, depending on the destination. But the probability that at least some freighters would get through, when the number of attempts grew large enough, approached 94%. The human merchant marine was not a fleet. It was a statistical phenomenon. But here is the thing that truly broke me. My analysts had assumed the human government was coordinating this effort, that somewhere on Earth, a group of admirals and logistics officers was issuing encrypted routing instructions, adjusting departure schedules, and managing the chaos. So we hunted for that command signal. We deployed every listening post, every signal intercept platform, every deep space sensor array we possessed across 1,000 light years. We scanned for the faintest whisper of a coordinated transmission, a single pulse that might indicate a centralized authority, and we found nothing, absolutely nothing. I ordered the sweep repeated 3 times, certain we had missed something. Still nothing. The human merchant marine was operating entirely without orders. This was not a plan. This was not a strategy. This was 40,000 individual human beings waking up on 40,000 different ships, looking at the same news feed that announced the blockade, and reaching the same quiet conclusion. The colonies were going to need supplies. And then, without anyone telling them to, they started flying. I remember sitting in my quarters that evening, staring at a wall display of intercepted human-civilian communications. We had translated a selection of messages from the outer colonies, sent in the first days after the blockade before the freighters began arriving. One message from a woman on Artemis 6 read, "We have 30 days of food left. The kids are scared. Tell Earth we love them." Another from a colony administrator on New Osaka simply said, "No ships can reach us. We understand. We will try to survive as long as we can." These were not battle cries. These were goodbyes. But then, a week later, the tone shifted. A message from the same administrator read, "A freighter arrived today. The captain said he charted a path through the rimward scar. He lost 2 of his crew to radiation sickness. He's already loading up for another run." I read that message 5 times. He lost 2 crew members and he was already loading for another run. What kind of species does that? I decided to find out. Using the captured navigation data from the Stardust asterisk, we identified a pattern. The captains were not just improvising routes, they were sharing information. Not through any official channel, but through an ancient, informal network of civilian hailing frequencies and cargo guild message boards. They were posting their routes, their hazards, their close calls, and other captains were reading them, adapting them, and posting their own. The network was completely open, completely unsecured. We could read it. But we could not stop it, because there was no single node to disable, no headquarters to bomb, no leader to assassinate. It was a conversation, and you cannot blockade a conversation. By day 52, my superiors in the high command were growing impatient. Fleet Admiral Corvoys, a granite-faced traditionalist who had never lost a campaign, summoned me to a direct briefing. I stood before him in the war chamber, surrounded by holographic battle maps that showed a blockade that was technically intact and strategically useless, and I told him the truth. I told him that the human supply line did not exist as a single entity. I told him that we were not fighting a navy or a government logistics corps. We were fighting 40,000 civilians who had decided, for reasons I could not adequately explain, that the colonies would not starve. Corvoys listened in silence. Then he asked me if I had lost my mind. He showed me our own intelligence reports, which estimated that at least 80% of the human freighters attempting the runs were being destroyed or turned back. The reports were wrong. I knew they were wrong because I had falsified them. I had been feeding the high command edited data for over a week, because the true numbers were so catastrophic to Dominion morale that I feared what Corvith would do if he saw them. The true number, the one I kept in a locked file on my personal console, was that 94% of the human captains were getting through. 94%. And the number was rising. They were learning. Every failed run, every ship lost to a pulsar flare or a debris field made the next captain smarter. The network was not just resilient, it was adaptive. It was evolving faster than we could respond. And deep in the back of my skull, a thought was forming that I could not yet speak aloud. It was not just that we could not win this war. It was that this war might not even be the right framework for understanding what was happening. The humans were not fighting us. They were simply refusing to allow our blockade to have consequences. I left Corvith's chamber with a vague promise to intensify interdiction efforts. But I knew there was nothing we could intensify. We had already deployed our entire hunter-killer fleet. We had already mined every known navigable route. The captains were now using routes we did not know existed and could not predict. One of them, a man named Elias Vance, had flown directly through the accretion disk of a feeding black hole, using the gravitational lensing effect to mask his emissions from our sensors. The maneuver was insane. The heat alone should have cooked his ship, but it worked. And his route data, posted to the civilian network the moment he docked, was now being used by 12 other captains. There is a concept in warfare called the unassailable flank. It means a position that cannot be attacked because it does not stay still. The human merchant marine had become an unassailable flank spanning 300 light years, composed of individual ships that never took the same path twice. I was a master of logistics, and I was being outmaneuvered by people who had never attended a military academy, who had never studied strategic theory, and who did not, as far as I could tell, even consider themselves soldiers. They considered themselves truckers, and truckers, apparently, consider impassable to be a suggestion. By day 58, I had stopped sleeping entirely. The stimulants were beginning to affect my judgment, but I could not rest. I was consumed by the need to understand the mechanism. I organized a deep-cover intelligence operation, embedding a Corvic spy in one of the human cargo guilds on a neutral station. The spy's mission was simple: find the person in charge of the relief effort, find the coordinator, find the command structure, and if it did not exist, find out how the humans were achieving coordination without it. The spy's first report arrived on day 61. It was one paragraph long. It read, "There is no coordinator, no command, no structure. I asked a captain named Miriam Joe how she decided to run the blockade. She looked at me and said somebody had to. Then she asked me to help load crates. I loaded crates. I do not know what else to report." I read the message and realized with a clarity that felt like the first clean breath I had taken in weeks that I had been asking the wrong questions. I had been looking for a weapon, a strategy, a countermeasure. But the humans had not built a weapon. They had simply been the kind of people who, when faced with a problem, loaded crates and flew into the dark. And the number of those people, it turned out, was enough. More than enough. The true horror was yet to come, because in 9 days I would discover just how deep this principle went, and I would wish I had never looked. I spent the next 9 days learning to stop being a strategist. The spy's second report arrived on day 62. He had embedded himself on a way station orbiting a gas giant in the new Osaka system, a grimy little port that had become a hub for the blockade runners. He described a scene that I would not have believed if I had not seen the sensor logs for myself. Freighters, dozens of them, packed into docking cradles designed for half that number, their crews trading cargo crates by hand across improvised gangways. No manifest officers, no central dispatcher. Just a chaotic, organic ballet of private citizens solving a logistics problem in real time. The spy reported that a freighter captain named Marcus Webb had lost an engine core on arrival and could not afford the repairs. Within 3 hours, 17 other captains had contributed spare parts, fuel, and credit. Webb shipped out the next morning with a full cargo hold and a new navigation chip donated by a stranger. The spy wrote, "They do not act like allies. They act like family. I do not think they understand the difference." That line sat in my mind like a stone. I had built my entire career on exploiting the friction between allies, the cracks that appear when different interests collide. But these humans were not operating on interest. They were operating on something older, something almost biological, and it was immune to every weapon I had. On day 64, we intercepted a message that changed everything. It was a tight beam transmission from Earth Command to the colonial governor of Artemis 6. We decrypted it in under an hour, expecting to find the hidden command structure, the shadowy hand guiding the merchant marine. What we found was a letter of surrender. Earth Command was authorizing the governor to negotiate terms with the Dominion, to accept whatever conditions we imposed in exchange for the safe evacuation of civilians. The message had been sent 2 days after the blockade began. It had been delayed by signal interference, bouncing through relay stations that were themselves disrupted by the minefield. It finally arrived on day 64, long after the freighters had already solved the problem. Earth Command had given up. The military leadership of humanity had looked at the same numbers I had, drawn the same conclusions, and told the colonies to prepare for the worst. And the colonies had not listened. Not because they were defiant, but because a captain named Miriam Joe, and a captain named Elias Vance, and a captain named Marcus Webb, and 40,000 others had already decided, each in the privacy of their own bridge, that surrender was not acceptable. They did not receive the memo. They did not need it. The official chain of command had broken, and the supply line had not only survived, it had grown stronger. I remember the moment I fully processed this. I was standing in my quarters, the decrypted message glowing on the wall, and I felt my entire understanding of war shift sideways. For 60 cycles, I had believed that victory came from control, control of routes, control of information, control of resources. But the humans had achieved more supply throughput than any military logistics corps in Dominion history, and they had done it without a single order being issued. Control was not their strength. Their strength was the opposite. It was agency, the ability of each individual unit to assess, decide, and act without waiting for permission. That was not a bug in their system. It was the system, and I had no doctrine to counter it. On day 65, I received authorization to conduct a direct interview with a captured human military officer, a logistics commander named Colonel Anya Petrov. She had been stationed on a forward base near the Kessler Corridor when the blockade hit, and she had been cut off from Earth Command for the first 3 weeks. I asked her what she did during that time. She shrugged, a human gesture that I was learning to read as a sign of casual practicality. "I called my cousin," she said. "He owns a cargo hauler. He called his friends. They called their friends." She paused, as if the next part was so obvious it barely needed saying. "You cut the highway, so we took the back roads. That's all this was." I stared at her. The back roads. Half the galaxy was a death trap of radiation and gravitational anomalies, and she was calling it a back road. I asked why she had not waited for orders from Earth Command. She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Orders weren't coming," she said, "and people were going to die. You don't wait for orders when people are going to die." She said it as if it were the most self-evident moral calculus in the universe. And for her, I realized it was. I spent the next 3 days digging into the personal histories of the blockade runners. Not their service records, most of them had none. I read their public correspondence, their Cargo Guild forum posts, their personal logs. What emerged was a picture that no intelligence report could capture. These were not soldiers. They were not heroes in the way my culture understood heroism. They were parents who had been on their way to deliver tractor parts when the news broke and had simply decided to reroute toward danger instead of away from it. They were gamblers who had calculated the odds and then chosen to ignore them. They were young crew members who had signed on because their captain asked, and they trusted their captain, and they did not want to let their captain down. There was no single motivation. There were 40,000 motivations, each one personal, each one sufficient. I had been searching for a lever, a pressure point, a way to make them stop. But you cannot pressure 40,000 different motivations into submission. You would have to reach into the soul of every single captain and break them individually. And even then, someone else would take their place. On day 68, I discovered the existence of a human named Joseph Okonkwo. Okonkwo was not a captain. He was a retired loading crew supervisor who had worked at the Tycho Deep Space Cargo Terminal for 43 years. When the blockade began, he was 71 years old. He had no combat training, no navigation expertise, no official role in the war effort. But he knew how to load a freighter faster than anyone else alive. Within the first week, he had organized a volunteer team of retired dock workers, and they had turned a derelict cargo bay on a neutral station into an assembly line that processed 3 times the throughput of any military facility in the sector. They were loading freighters in hours that should have taken days. They were doing it on their own time with their own equipment for no pay. I sent a team to interview Okonkwo. The transcript was 800 pages long, mostly because Okonkwo could not stop talking about the specifications of modular container couplings, the optimal stacking height for grain crates in variable gravity, and the precise torque requirements for magnetic cargo locks. The man was not a warrior. He was a logistician, a better logistician than any I had in my command, and he had been running a civilian cargo dock his entire life. And when the blockade began, he had not waited for the military to ask for his help. He had simply shown up and started working. I realized then that the human capacity for decentralized response went far beyond the freighters. It was in their dock workers, their engineers, their fuel station attendants, their cafeteria cooks who kept the crews fed between runs. It was an entire civilization that, when faced with an obstacle, did not ask for permission. They just did the work. And I could not blockade that. No one could. On day 70, I finally understood why I had been wishing I had never looked. The realization arrived not as a flash but as a slow, creeping dread, like the cold seeping through a hull breach. I had been treating the human merchant marine as a supply line that I could sever. But it was not a line. It was not even a network. It was a behavior. It was the emergent consequence of a culture that trusted individuals to make decisions, that rewarded initiative, that considered somebody had to a sufficient reason to risk death. And that behavior, once triggered, could not be suppressed by any external force. You could not bomb it, mine it, or blockade it because it did not exist in any single place. It was everywhere, and it was now spreading to the colonies themselves. The freighters were not just delivering food. They were delivering hope, and in that hope the colonies were finding their own agency. They were building internal supply chains, organizing local defense forces, innovating solutions to problems we had not even anticipated. The blockade had not weakened them. It had awakened them. And we, the Korthik Dominion, had been the instrument of that awakening. I sat in my command center that night, the one light flickering overhead, and I wrote a final report to the High Command. I told them the truth, that the blockade was not only failing, it was creating an enemy far more dangerous than the one we had meant to contain. I told them that the human supply line did not exist and therefore could not be cut, and that the war they were contemplating would be a war against a fog, a war in which every inch of ground we captured would be meaningless because the ground was never the point. The point was the people, and the people would keep going, no matter what we did. I filed the report. Then I sat back and waited for the war to end, one way or another. because I knew, with a certainty that hollowed me out from the inside, that we had already lost. We just didn't know it yet. And when the High Command read my words, they would face a choice: abandon the war or escalate it into something that would destroy us both. I already knew which one they would pick. The High Command did not abandon the war. On day 72, Fleet Admiral Corvith summoned me to a closed session of the War Council. He projected my own report onto the central holoscreen, the damning paragraphs glowing for every admiral to read. The room was silent. I could smell the tension on their scales. Corvith fixed me with a stare that had ordered the deaths of worlds. "You are telling this council that we cannot win against a civilian fleet with no central command, no supply lines, and no weapons," he said. I did not flinch. "I am telling you that we have already lost. The question is whether we will lose gracefully or catastrophically." The silence deepened. Then General Orvek, the head of ground forces, laughed. It was a bitter, dismissive sound, the laugh of a soldier who thought logistics officers were glorified accountants. "Then we escalate," he said. "We bombard the colonies themselves. If the freighters keep delivering, we make sure there is nothing left to deliver to." The room erupted. Some admirals nodded. Others recoiled. I felt the cold certainty I had been carrying for days finally harden into something I could articulate. I raised my voice, cutting through the debate. "You cannot bombard the colonies," I said. "Not because it is immoral, but because you will not reach them. The same decentralized phenomenon that supplies them also protects them. Shall I explain how?" I pulled up the scans we had taken of the system approach vectors. Every colony was now ringed with a thick shell of civilian ships. Not warships. Not defense platforms. Just freighters and courier vessels and personal yachts and even a few retrofitted mining rigs, all positioned in a constantly shifting pattern around the approach lanes. Any Dominion assault fleet would have to fly through a cloud of unpredictable, unarmed ships that were broadcasting their civilian status on every frequency. The moment our targeting systems locked onto a freighter, it would move. Another would replace it. The humans had turned their merchant marine into a living shield, and if we fired, the entire galaxy would see us slaughtering unarmed civilians delivering food. Every neutral species in the Republic would condemn us. Every trade partner would close their borders. We would win a few burning colonies and lose the entire diplomatic field, and the colonies would still be resupplied through the other routes we could not find. Orvik stared at the scan. His jaw worked. I saw the moment he understood. There was no escalation that did not destroy us first. The council recessed without a decision. That evening, I walked alone through the corridors of the Dominion flagship, the Iron Resolve Asterisk. I thought about the human captain who had smiled at me during interrogation. I thought about Joseph Okonkwo, the old dockworker who had mobilized a loading crew without asking anyone's permission. I thought about the millions of individuals in those colonies who had been told they would die and then had watched cargo ships appear on their horizons day after day because 40,000 strangers had refused to let them down. And I realized with a weariness that was almost relief that the Dominion had finally encountered something it could not crush with force. It was not a weapon. It was a culture. And cultures do not surrender. Day 75 brought the final crisis. A human freighter named the Hopewell was intercepted near the colony of New Kyoto. Its captain, a young woman named Sana Okoro, had attempted a route through a magnetar field that no sane navigator would chart. Her ship was crippled, life support failing, cargo hold breached. A Dominion hunter-killer moved to capture her. Standard procedure: board, interrogate, impound. But before they could dock, something happened that no one in my command had anticipated. 12 other human freighters, all in the system on their own resupply runs, altered course and converged on the Hopewell asterisk. They had no weapons. They had no way to fight the hunter-killer. But they positioned themselves between the Dominion ship and the crippled freighter, a wall of unarmed cargo haulers standing in formation. The hunter-killer's captain, A disciplined officer named Keithrell hailed me for orders. He did not want to fire on civilians. He was a soldier, not a butcher. And I knew in that moment that I could not give him an order that would make him one. I told him to withdraw. He did. The freighters rescued Captain Akaro and her crew, and the Hopewell was towed to New Kyoto for repairs. The cargo, grain, medical supplies, and a crate of children's books destined for a colony school was delivered 40 hours late. The children's books arrived slightly singed but readable. I saw the image on an intercepted civilian feed. A little human girl holding a book about starships, her face lit with wonder. The book was titled Why We Fly Asterisk. I requested a translation. It was about a small bird who crossed an ocean, not because it knew the way, but because it believed there was land on the other side. I closed the file. My claws were trembling. On day 78, the High Command reconvened. Admiral Corvith announced the decision. The Dominion would not escalate. The blockade would be formally downgraded to a containment posture, which meant we would maintain the appearance of interdiction while accepting that we could not stop the flow. The war, such as it was, would become a cold stalemate. Orvik stormed out. Corvith dismissed the council, but as I turned to leave, he called my name. He was standing by the viewport, staring at the cold stars. "You were right, Threthval," he said, "but knowing that does not bring comfort." I told him it never did. Then I asked the one question that had been gnawing at me since day one. Why did Earth Command never issue an order? I had dug through every intercepted transmission. There had been no central directive, no speech, no mobilization plan. The civilian fleet had simply gone. Corvith turned to me. "Because they didn't need to," he said. "They knew their people would move. That is the difference between us and them. We command, they trust." The word hit me like a physical blow. Trust, not control. Trust that when the moment came, enough individuals would make the right choice without being told. That was the mechanism. That was the answer I had been searching for. I had spent my whole career perfecting the art of command, and I had overlooked the one thing that made command unnecessary: belief in each other. The Dominion never officially recognized the failure of the Kessler Corridor blockade. The minefield is still there, a monument to strategic irrelevance. Every year, a handful of human freighters still fly through it anyway, because one of the captains mapped a fun route through the gaps and posted it online. The casualties are minimal. The colonies are thriving. And I Threthval, the finest logistics analyst the Korthik Dominion ever produced, was quietly reassigned to a research position on a backwater station, where I spend my days studying human organizational theory. My colleagues believe I am writing a treatise on decentralized supply chains. They are not wrong, but the real project is more personal. I am trying to understand how a species so fragile, so short-lived, so seemingly chaotic, managed to do what no empire in galactic history has ever done: turn conviction into an unbreakable resource. Because that is what happened in the Kessler Corridor. 40,000 people, each making a private decision, created a supply line that was not a line, a chain that was not a chain, a fleet that was not a fleet. And in doing so, they revealed a truth that every military doctrine in the galaxy had missed. You cannot destroy a choice. You cannot bomb a promise. You cannot starve a people who have decided, individually and collectively, that they will not let each other down. The humans did not win the blockade. They simply refused to lose. And that is a lesson I will carry until the day my scales go cold. I have been asked in the years since what I learned from the Kessler Corridor. The answer is not what anyone expects. I did not learn a new tactic, though I have cataloged dozens. I did not discover a weakness in human psychology, though I have studied their strange, stubborn minds until I could map their contradictions in my sleep. What I learned is that every assumption I had ever made about power was wrong. Power is not the ability to strike. It is not the ability to withhold. True power, the kind that cannot be broken from the outside, is the ability to trust. To trust that when the path closes, someone will find a new one. That when the order does not come, someone will act anyway. That when the cost becomes unbearable, someone will pay it without being asked. The humans did not defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with a culture of autonomous care, a reflexive refusal to abandon one another that operated at a scale no command structure could replicate. And that, I now believe, is not merely a military curiosity. It is a civilizational advantage. Think about the systems you rely on. The supply chains, the power grids, the information networks. Most of them are built on the Dominion model, centralized, optimized, fragile. A single point of failure can bring the whole thing down. The humans, by accident or by evolution, built something different. A web so dense with individual decision-making that no single cut could sever it. The question I now ask every species I encounter is this: if your command center went dark tomorrow, would your people still move? Would a dockworker like Joseph Okonkwo walk into an abandoned cargo bay and start loading freighters? Would a captain like Sana Akoro plot a suicide course through a magnetar field because a child on a distant colony needed a book about starships? The answer separates civilizations that will endure from those that will not. And I fear the Dominion's answer, if I am honest. We were trained to obey. They were raised to decide. That is the difference that shattered our blockade. That is the difference that will shape the next century. I do not know if this story offers hope or warning, perhaps both. What I do know is that the galaxy is watching humanity now, not with the condescension of old, but with a wary, uncertain respect. They are not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most advanced, but they have something that cannot be measured in tonnage or firepower. Distributed spine, a collective will that does not require a command. And if you take only one thing from this account, let it be what I failed to understand until it was far too late. You cannot blockade a decision. You cannot starve a people who have already decided to feed each other. That is not idealism, that is logistics. The ships are still flying, the colonies are still eating, the books are still arriving, and I, Threthval, am still learning. If this story stayed with you, then pass it on. There are thousands of other narratives just as strange, just as quietly world-breaking. And I suspect you know someone who needs to hear that the way things have always been is not the way they must remain. Subscribe, and we will tell them together.